Yeah, I don't know if I would say that God is fair. Insofar as, our paradigm for fairness is based on a human expression of justice.
Yeah.
And in justice, you're rendering to another what is his due, but you're doing so according to a standard of equality, which equality can't really be grounded in our relationship to God. And that doesn't mean to say that he floats free of all morality. It's just that he is subsisting, morality in a certain sense, insofar as I would say that there's a non parallelism between God's relationship to us and our relationship to God. And I think that's part of, yeah, there are a lot of interrelated things that I'm going to get too excited about and talk too fast about. Deep breath. So, with respect to the doctrine of creation, I think that one, the relation of creation, and then the, as it were, goal of creation. And here I'm relying on revelation. I'm not smart enough to figure this out. So,
I think this is an awesome conversation that maybe anyone I've ever communicated with has had these kind of questions, whether they believe in God or not. So I kind of wanted to go over this conversation. Alex O'Connor, and it's Gregory Pine. Never heard of the person. Dude looks super cool though. He's like he's like a super cool monk. But this conversation is kind of amazing to me, and it kind of goes into the thoughts of I think millions of people. I have these questions and these thoughts about God, and the first thing he talks about is he's relying on revelation, and to me that is just saying you're just kind of relying on yourself, because there's no way of proving that the revelation is from anywhere beside your own brain. So this is an interesting conversation. Let's get back into it and hear some more.
that's a kind of dependence of all things upon God. And that's the heart of the matter, that everything that is by God's gift. And so this note of gratuity enters at the outset, so that none of us are due anything, because it could have been otherwise and it could not have been. And as a result of which, what we have come to possess in time, is God's gift, but that it's earmarked for glory, or that it's earmarked for a return to God. And I think part of the complexity and subtlety of the divine plan is, regardless of the gifts that are apportioned in the natural order, that there are further gifts in store in the supernatural order, which are not directly correlated with those of the natural order. So, like, for instance, Saint Therese of Lisieux, who lived in the late 19th century, she dies of tuberculosis at the age of 24, but she has these wild insights into the divine mercy, or these wild insights into the divine condescension, which in a certain sense like catapult her beyond the limitations of body and soul, while still retaining a kind of organic connection with her personality and with her history. And so I think that God he's bringing about a certain differentiation in creation, because he's not motivated by a bland equality, because in a certain sense, and I don't pretend to know the mind of God, but in a certain sense, he says to himself,
Isn't he pretending to know the mind of God? I think that's the problem with a lot of this. I love that I paused this right on his face like that, because that's how I feel when we, right, this guy is we too, when we're just trying to make excuses for whatever we believe in. And this is in so many beliefs. This is what we sound like to me, when it's so hard just to say what you believe doesn't make any sense. This is what you sound like. He has to know that he's contradicting himself a bit. You can't say that you rely on revelation and then say there's no way I can know the mind of God. The latter is true. There's no way we can know the mind of God. No way. There's just no way.
in the differentiation of creation, my divine life, which is, ineffable, the depths of which are unsoundable, stands a better chance at captivating or capturing the attention of creatures, because on account of the fact that I am infinite, a kind of wellspring of divine abundance, no one created thing can express that sufficiently. And so he expends himself in creation, saying it differently, with the intent that both in its being and acting, and in the ultimate orientation of its being and acting to God, that you see both in the creature and in the ecosystematic harmony of the creatures taken as a whole or taken as a universe, right? Something more that God, as it were, hides both in the things and then in their relations as a way by which to afford us further opportunities for noticing. But I've been talking too long.
Well, I want to understand the relevance of this to the experience of saying, look, I'm somebody who maybe I used to be a new atheist saying that God is some celestial dictator. Maybe he is a celestial dictator, but I think maybe the celestial part sort of undermines the badness of the dictator part. Who knows? But, you shake that off and you say, okay, look, religion isn't all evil. Heaven isn't some kind of North Korea. It's actually a quite pleasurable sounding experience. If there are such things as sort of moral truths, then I want to apprehend and follow them. And I want to worship that which deserves to be worshipped. And I want to see my family and friends again. The whole works. I'm just not convinced. I just don't think it's true. I've listened to arguments and maybe I've had an irrational response to them, but I've tried my best. And, if I'm limited only by my cognitive capacity, then I can hardly be blamed for that. Maybe I should have tried harder in school, but that seems like a quite loose basis on which to balance my soul for eternity. And I think that in itself would be something of a problem of evil, one of the many problems of evil. Okay, so here's the situation that I'm in, and this is the situation that many people are in. And it may not be the case that I'm truly seeking properly. It may be that I'm what Schellenberg has called a resistant non-believer. That is, your person who sort of has some kind of proactive defensiveness.
To me, if you have some proactive defensiveness, as Alex says here, you were just made that way. I don't think people are sitting there choosing to not believe. Like, it's not your fault if you don't believe. It's kind of like you were just born the way you were, and God would have made you that way as well. So I think God would also have figured out how to make you believe, not make you believe, but show you whatever you need to be shown. It's kind of why I don't believe that a lot of the things of the Bible were just people writing, trying to understand God. And God, to me, is way more, not even intelligent. God's just beyond all of that stuff. So God wouldn't be as petty. God, if this was some kind of plan, the plan would be perfect and everybody would make it, by the way. Because to say God had a plan and God is perfect, but God's plan involves people not making it, I don't know about that one. It just, that doesn't add up. That just sounds like people's stories, our human stories. And because all we know as humans is we don't know what perfect is. So any story that a human would come up with would obviously have flaws in it. And the stories of God have flaws in them, which to me contradict what a perfect God would be. I don't even think we can imagine how perfect is. So we have to create flaws even in something that we call perfect. And that's why we have the stories that we have. This is why this monk has to come up with excuses, because the stories that we have only make sense if they were written by people.
And this is certainly true of many people, but so long as there is a single example, it doesn't have to be me, of somebody who sincerely seeks but doesn't find an answer, then what I'm looking for, I suppose, is either an explanation for that, an explanation of that experience, some kind of second order explanation which makes that not a problem to worry about, or itself what I'm doing wrong so as not to experience that. A question that I often ask is what you would do if you woke up tomorrow, sort of in my mind, as it were, you just found yourself convinced that the arguments don't run anymore, in the way that you've heard about conspiracy theories that the moon landing was fake, but you just sort of you intuitively think it's ridiculous. And even if you start to look into them a bit, you think, no, there's no way these are true. And if somehow the eternity of your soul was balanced upon, was predicated upon you accepting that the moon landing didn't occur, and I'm not trying to say that the arguments for God are of the same caliber, but by analogy, something that, look, arguments do exist, and they're discussed ad nauseum on the internet, but when you listen to them, you don't get to choose not to be convinced by them. You're just not. If that's the case, I ask, if you found yourself in that situation, what would you change? What is it, in other words, that I might be doing wrong?
Yeah. I suspect I probably agree with you on the paper-thin quality of human volition. I think that in past generations, human volition has been described as something Herculean or colossal, and I just don't think that's really tenable. I think more often it's a matter of we're dealt a hand, and then we're asked to play the hand. The rules of the game are somewhat simple, not overly complex, but that we can choose to play the hand, even if it seems like a losing hand. We can play it with a kind of whimsy or panache, and I think that that's largely what freedom amounts to. So I'm not saying that everyone has opinions which they find to be perfectly malleable or revisable. Like, for instance, there's just the fact of human investment. You know, think of like a Protestant pastor who is thinking about becoming Catholic. That's his livelihood, you know? And you might say perhaps it's better not to involve oneself, like by way of livelihood, in a thing that you might decouple yourself from in subsequent, months or years. But that's not humane. You know, we all do that. We all hitch our wagon to whatever it is. So I think that, one thing I would say is this. With respect to our rank in creation, and then with respect to differentiation amongst human beings, I would say that we're called to live this life. So not the life of rocks, or of plants, or of animals, or of angels, but of men. And so, like when St. Thomas, for instance, describes the movement proper to each, echelon or rank, he'll say God, makes no movements. Insofar as movement for him, is an expression of coming to be. He says angels, they come to their end by one movement, whereas men come to their end by many movements. So I think that there can be a kind of tendency to falsify our human experience by focusing on certain moments of it, or even like tranches of it, when truth be told, it's over the course, right? It's discursive, it's diachronic. And I think that we have two modes in which we operate: the living of our lives and then the interpreting of our lives. Some people might want to break that into further modes still. But I think that we learn to live our lives well, and we also learn to interpret our lives well. And as time passes, provided we're doing so sincerely, I would add in Christian context, by the grace of God, we get better at interpreting our lives. So like, for instance, if you had asked me in 2010, like, why did you become a Dominican friar? I would have told you like a hoorah story. It would have sounded like an army recruitment story. And you'd be like, that's precious. 13 years in, like, I'm not utterly ground down, but I have had to suffer more for it. And as a result of which, the story that I'm going to tell you is different.
I guess this is kind of another contradiction to me, or another coping mechanism of someone that can't just say that either something's just not right, or that they're wrong, or that they have no clue. Because yes, when you're younger, you think you have an understanding of life, and then you get older, and then you have another understanding of life. There's nothing to say that just because you are older that you are wiser. You are wiser. Maybe you're wiser. You're maybe wiser compared to what you were, and it's only off of knowledge, but that knowledge can also be false. Your perceptions can also be false. Or I don't know if I can say perceptions are false, but what truths you gain from your perceptions or experiences can still be false, because your feelings have nothing to do with the truth. And that's I just kind of contradicted myself now, but that's one thing I've learned, is like, your feelings don't point to the truth at all. So if your feelings are to believe in something, you'll get older and you'll be able to speak to them better, but you still might not have any more proof than you did when you were younger. So it's just kind of interesting to hear him say that And when I hear it, I still hear somebody that is really confused still, but just might be speaking better and be able to make their confusion sound more together, I guess. Make their confusion sound more, yeah, I mean, I guess together. There's a word I'm trying to think of. I just can't think of it. But he still sounds confused to me. Like still sounds like he doesn't have an answer.
And that doesn't mean that the story that I told you 13 years ago was necessarily false. It was, and nor was it just wholly perspectival. It's like I can't relate to myself back then. No, there's continuity. There's narrative continuity. But I would say that it's deeper, it's subtler, and I've picked out certain hues on the palette which I didn't perceive earlier, in part because of the way that life seasons your experience or kind of draws out the flavor of your experience. And so I think too, like for you now, that's probably, I mean, like I don't want to make it too terribly personal because then it just becomes somewhat inextricable, you know. But I also think that like patience, not just in the mere, you know, the virtue that is commended to us by our schoolroom nannies, but patience in the sense of, you know, like patio or pottery, like to suffer life well, not to be dramatic about it, but like a lot of life is endurance. St. Thomas Aquinas, when he talks about the virtue of courage, he says there are two principal parts, the attack dimension and the endure dimension. He says the endure dimension is the principal part because life is hard in effect and because we need to bear up. And he breaks it out into two further pieces, which are patience and perseverance. Patience, which bears up under sadness, which I would say is one of the principal obstacles of living in the 21st century, and then perseverance, which sees it through to the end. So I think that there's something to the time-bound nature of our lives and God, his revelation interfacing with the time-bound nature of our lives, which forces us to kind of undergo it or to, you know, like recognize and receive it with a certain patience.
Okay, in the context of what I'm talking about, that is the evil, if God does exist, seemingly, or the sort of ostensible, apparent evil of people being withheld from communion with him.
Yeah.
In the context of speaking about that, taking a more holistic approach to a person's life might be helpful, but there are still, I think, quite jarring problems with this. For example, I presume you believe in libertarian free will.
What the thing that I hold for antedates like the distinctions in which we currently traffic,
Sure,
and so I'm
human,
just a troll.
human beings get to
Choose stuff.
choose stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And so perhaps it's the case that I'm on some kind of grand theological journey. And that is that maybe when I turn 45, I'm going to see my sort of waterfall split into three streams and fall to my knees and accept Christ. Problematically, you know, Cameron sat over there has libertarian free will. He could choose to stand up and stab me in the throat and kill me now.
Yeah.
I would die. I would come before God and I would fall short and I wouldn't have accepted the sacrifice of Jesus. If I am being used in some kind of, well, I shouldn't say used, if I'm part of some kind of grand theological journey, is the way I worded it, this can be cut short by another human being's actions and presumably, therefore, you know, also cut off the road to redemption. Now, some people have suggested to me when I pointed this out that, well, okay, because people sometimes say to me that it's a good job I'm an atheist because when I finally convert to Christianity, I'll provide such a great story for people to look to. It would be some kind of road to Damascus-esque, you know, narrative that people can refer to. Fine. Firstly, I feel like I'm being sort of used as a bit of a pawn.
Yeah.
But secondly, if that is the case, this can be cut short by another human being.
Yeah.
And sometimes people then say to me, well, if that were to happen, God would know what you would have done. They take a sort of Molinist view or something. They say, well, look, you know, of course, if you die now, you're not making it to heaven. But God knows that if you would have stayed alive, that's what you would have done. And so you get to heaven on that account. If that's the case, then I don't see the point in this veil of tears altogether, because there's no point in running the exam if God already knows what everybody's going to get, if you know what I mean. So I'm not sure if what you were saying was a direct response to my point that people live with essentially the suffering of this privation of communion with God. Even looking at it as a journey, even if I look at it as something that could potentially develop over time, this is something that can be trivially cut short by another human being's actions. All of this put together just ascribes an arbitrariness and triviality to the conditions under which my eternal soul either receives this unimaginably pleasurable communion with goodness itself, or whatever your sort of doctrine of the afterlife for those who are not so lucky is. I don't know what it is. I don't know if you're an annihilationist. Even that, compared to the infinite goodness of communion with God, is, a sort of infinitely bad outcome. These problems, people have syllogized them. They've sort of been a bit analytical about it. They've done premise, conclusion. But can you feel the arbitrariness, the triviality of what I'm talking about here?
Yeah.
And so, if I were you in a situation of thinking, okay, there are lots of people on planet Earth who are seeking very, very desperately, and they're not finding God, but I've got a relationship with Him. I'd say lucky me, and you probably do say lucky me, but lucky you is unlucky me, if you know what I mean, and that's something that I think needs to be accounted for.
Yeah, I love that part. That whole section is kind of why I just let it play, because it's so true, and I can only imagine that everyone struggles with that. I don't even know how to say it. I just imagine that everybody struggles with that thought process there. And to me, it's also why the answers of man never hold up to a lot of scrutiny, and they always sound horrible. I'm not too sure how he's about to answer this, but there is no answer when you have to speak from like a human mind, because none of these people ever say something so extraordinary that makes sense. It's always excuses, and God doesn't need excuses. God wouldn't have excuses. If this is a plan, it would be perfect, and yeah, it would just be perfect. So anything that this man's about to say is just going to come from his human brain, which is going to have human knowledge, which is going to limit him to any true answer. And maybe the answer is just the answer that no one would want to hear, but God can't communicate with us. That would make more sense. That doesn't even make sense either. I don't know. Or not that God can't communicate with us. God's not what this is, what the Bible and stuff portrays. And it's a difficult thing for me to even kind of talk about. It's like I'm even stumbling. It makes sense like that. I'm stumbling too. Like I said, when you're trying to come up with answers in your human brain, they just don't make sense. Like as I was speaking my answer, at least I'm not at least, but I am able to be objective and sometimes see that my answers don't make sense as well. And to me, once you keep doing that, it's just like, oh, we're probably wrong. That's kind of what my conclusion gets to. All right, sorry, talking too long. Let's continue.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think so like a couple of speculative backstops and then maybe some more practical or existential things to advance, I suppose. So the one would be that this vision, the hierarchical nature of creation or the differentiated nature of creation, and also differentiation within the ranks, like our human rank, it pertains to the wisdom of God as to see it through. So like taking an example, from Revelation, Catholics believe in a doctrine of predilection, namely that God loves everyone the same, but that he loves some people in a certain sense more than others, insofar as he accords them greater goods. So prima pars question 20, article 3, it's scandalous, but it's also somewhat beautiful seen from a particular angle, insofar as the point of the differentiation of the goods accorded to those who occupy the rank of human is for like an organic end, insofar as he describes it in the context of the mystical body of Christ. So it's not like, it's not so much better and worse as it is like heart and lungs. Now, mind you, you're going to look at the thing and you're going to see the person who was born blind and club-footed and, with all sorts of sufferings. And you're going to say, I'm sorry, heart and lungs, this is decidedly better and worse. And yet, And this is where I think that, a defense sometimes works better than like a straight theodicy, insofar as you can tell a story of that person's life, not in every case, obviously, but in some cases, whereby God will use even that. Not in the sense that God visited this thing because we have sufficient material conditions whereby to account for the fact that nature fails. It obtains always or for the most part, and that God, entrusting creation to a certain kind of set of conditions, as it were, admits for this possibility, but in light of a glory that lies in store, without chewing up and spitting out those who are involved in it as if they were mere pawns. So, like, on the one hand, you've got this doctrine of predilection, so differentiation in the goods given, but then on the other hand, you have it in a personalistic whole, the idea that it's for the other. So, like the Blessed Virgin Mary, for instance, I believe that God loves her most of those who are not God. And I don't.
Yeah, it's just, and like I said, I'm not trying to attack this guy. It's just another contradiction. He's saying that God loves everybody the same, but it's this human thinking again, and it's kind of like if you have kids, you can say, "Oh, I love all my kids the same," but this one's my favorite. We would all be able to say that no, you don't love your kids the same. Then that's obvious when you can say that. So this is just humans explaining how humans would act, and that's the only way. I said it's nothing against this guy. That is the only way we can answer anything is from our own perspective. We cannot be anything but what we are. So to me, there's no way we can understand God. And that's kind of my thought on that. I do want to get to one other section on this because I liked the conversation. So I'm going to skip ahead to that. Let me know what you think about this little portion, and we'll jump to the next one.
If you wanna.
I wanted to ask what your view of hell is, not in too much detail. I just want to know what we're talking about here when you talk about hell.
The absence of God. So God continues to be present by essence, presence, and power, in the sense that God continues to give being and agency, but one is entirely distant from the life of grace and has foreclosed on the possibility of the life of grace.
And do you think this is a sort of a form of suffering? Do you think it's a sort of conscious torment, not of the kind of flames and brimstone, but a consciously endured suffering?
I think it is. Yeah, I'm not an annihilationist.
And for eternity?
I do.
Okay. So there was something I wanted to ask about when you were talking about people freely rejecting this gift. Do you think, as I do, that if it is true that this place, hell, exists, and that you somehow know you're going there and know the means to escape it, but choose not to do that anyway, that you are almost necessarily acting irrationally?
Yes. I mean, insofar as all sin is contrary to right reason, I think there's a kind of irrationality at the heart of it.
So my issue with this is that I think the only reason why somebody could possibly make that decision is if they either don't fully understand the situation or aren't convinced that it's true. Reason being that I think if you showed somebody hell and they knew that it existed, they knew with 100% certainty that it existed, and they knew that the way to avoid this is to, throw your life on Christ. People might struggle to varying degrees, but I don't even know if it would be possible for a person to not choose to at least try to do that. Now, you might want to say, Satan chose to fall away from God even though he had full knowledge. I mean, this is a poetic story, but I don't know if such a person could actually exist in reality. And that's because I think that what we're dealing with is essentially a form of threat, although I know you're not going to want to sort of view it in those terms, but there's some philosophical literature on the difference between an offer and a threat, and it's actually quite difficult to pull apart. Like, you can phrase it as, I'm going to offer you $1 million a year more to change your job, and that sounds like an offer, but it also kind of sounds like saying, there's a way of sort of thinking it in your mind of like, well, if you don't do this thing, then I'm going to sort of I'm going to prevent you from having $1 million that you otherwise could have had. It seems like you're almost being threatened. Now, there are various ways to get around this, but the literature is that I remember having read at university, it was far more like surprising in terms of the responses it has to the obvious answers that might spring to mind. At any rate, it seems to me a bit like something like that's going on, where it's not just a good offer, it's goodness. You're being offered goodness. And if a person fully apprehends that that's what's on offer, I think it's impossible to rationally choose to reject it. And what that means is that the only people who can reject that, in my view, are people who are acting irrationally. And generally, when sort of somebody's rationality goes wrong, it's not exactly their fault. In fact, that's kind of like what irrationality is. It's like the reasoning faculty has gone wrong. You know, it's not like you've reasoned it and you've got it rationally correct. You just choose not to. Irrationality means that hasn't happened. Otherwise, I think that somebody must just not be convinced that this is actually the case. In either case, I don't think it's fair that somebody can be sent to hell, if you see what I'm saying. I wonder if you have any reflections on that, in other words.
Yeah. So a couple initial thoughts are, with respect to the things that you cannot but choose or choose against, in the Catholic tradition, there's just one. It's the vision of God, like in his being, as it were, or in his essence. But everything else, on account of the fact that the evil or the good that it proffers is limited, leaves you free, insofar as you're free to see it from various vantages or under various aspects, and you can choose volition or nolition. So with respect to the vision of hell, that might function as a kind of motive of credibility, like the person who is proposing to you the life of heaven in showing you the life of hell gives you reason to believe his or her testimony. But that's a different noetic act. It's a reliance upon the testimony of the testator, whereas faith, strictly speaking, leans on the divine truth, right? So it's about the veracity of the thing itself and the God who speaks to it. So I would say that hell, scary, but it's conceivable for me that people would see it and then still slump in that direction. And in part because, you think about the Gospels, plenty of people saw the things that Jesus did of a miraculous sort and turned away because the cost was too significant for them, or because they chose to look away, or because they got distracted or dispersed, or for whatever other reason.
But those two last, so for instance, being distracted, that seems not to be their fault. If you're distracted by something,
I think that we're responsible for attention. Yeah.
I can see that to some degree, but also, I mean, if somebody sees Jesus's acts and decides, you said, like, for instance, there's too much cost, surely if they actually apprehended what was really happening in front of them, what was really being offered, then they couldn't think the cost was too high.
All right, I want to end it on that one just because I like that ending. How can someone see that, know that 100% for sure, and still think the cost is too high? The reason it doesn't make sense to me, once again, is because what we are told God is made up by people. And that's why it never can make sense, because God is beyond anything that a human could ever think of. So our only explanations that we have make no damn sense. Doesn't mean God doesn't exist, but our explanations for God make no sense because we only are stuck in our own little bubble. We don't know. We have no clue what's outside of this bubble. I'll end it with that. I'll have the not debate. This isn't even a debate. This is just a discussion, which I liked as well. And I'll have that with the link in the description so you can take a look. If you want to comment, go ahead and I can chat with you. If not, I'll still continue to do these, guys, because I watch these things and I just have to talk, and I don't care if anyone's listening or not. I have to get this stuff off my brain. And if I'm speaking to myself, that's fine. But thanks everyone that did listen. If you want to chat, let me know. Peace out, guys.